Recording in progress.
Okay, let's call the meeting of the Planning Commission for August 3rd, 2023 to order. And first off, could we establish a quorum? Stephanie, could you do a roll call, please?
Commissioner Disney?
Here.
Commissioner Beninato?
Here.
Commissioner Duran?
Here, it's Doran, just so you know.
Sorry, Doran.
Doran.
Commissioner Roach?
Here.
Commissioner Steinle?
Here.
Vice Chair Ahi?
Here.
And Chair Mensinger.
Here.
So all commissioners present.
Great, so we have a quorum. Okay, are there any comments from the public for items not on the agenda? Do we have anyone on Zoom or? Okay, so we will move on then. Okay, first item is approving the minutes from our last meeting on July 6th. Do we have a motion?
I'll move that we approve the minutes of the last meeting.
Second that?
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Could we call the roll?
Commissioner Disney?
Yes.
Commissioner Beninato?
Yes.
Commissioner Doran?
Yes.
Commissioner Roach?
Yes.
Commissioner Steinle?
Yes.
Vice Chair Ahi?
Yes.
And Chair Mensinger.
Yes. Okay, next is our public hearing for tonight, which is on a zone text amendment related to the sixth cycle of the housing element. So I believe staff has a report for us.
Yes, I do. Thank you, Chair. So Nick Zorn's Development Services Director. I'm going to kind of fly through the slides pretty quickly just because a lot of it is more so substance in the actual ordinance if we need to get into some explanation and detail associated with what we are proposing tonight. So this evening we are going to review the draft ordinance, which is considered specialized housing regulations. Background, since it's actually been a few months since we have seen a housing element implementing ordinance here at the city of Los Altos, is as a reminder, on January 24th, 2003, the City Council did adopt the sixth cycle housing element and certified the MND associated with the housing element. As we all know, is that there are various programs identified in the housing element that do implement essentially all of our deliverables, and so this ordinance is going to be building upon that. Again, just to specify, because we're not going to be going over the specific timeframes and funding sources or quantified objectives because it's pretty straightforward, but each of the programs do establish an overview of the topic, specific steps that the city will take, time frame on when we will do these deliverables by, funding sources, and then again the quantified objectives of the intent essentially of each individual program. So jumping into the meat and potatoes of the ordinance as drafted and presented to the Planning Commission for your consideration and recommendation tonight is Program 4C. I'm just going to go over the main title block of what each individual program is titled, and it's pretty self-explanatory from there. Program 4C is to allow low barrier navigation centers consistent with AB 101. Additionally, as I believe the commissioners all are aware, is there were a significant amount of background information and legislative history from the California State Legislature, as well as FAQs that had been prepared by HCD and attached to the staff report. So those are supporting documents that help to illuminate what we are required to do. Moving on to program 4D is to allow transitional and supportive housing consistent with state law. This is, again, one of the specialized housing types that are requirements of the housing elements. Essentially, Some folks somewhat think of these as shelters, but they are operatively a lot different because of the services that they actually provide the individuals that are housed there. And there's obviously, if you look through some of the regulations that are contained within the draft ordinance, there are some associated kind of strings attached in regards to length of stay, requirements of the operation of the facilities, and the services that ultimately are provided to the population that actually reside in that specialized housing type. Program 4E is to allow employee/farm worker housing consistent with state law. This is, I know sometimes a little bit of a ringer for some jurisdictions because the farming and agriculture industry has really kind of faded away over time, but this does allow for the possibility of this specialized housing type where ag is still allowed pursuant to the adopted zoning that is already in existence. And then moving on to the fourth and final program that is associated with the draft ordinance is program 4F, which is to reasonably accommodate disabled persons' housing needs. So this is most commonly referred to as reasonable accommodations, which is what you would see also in the draft ordinance. This is for if there is any confines of the zoning code that would prohibit certain improvements essentially for ADA access or for the easier mobility and enjoyment of private property that would then not have to go through, let's say, the full-on variance process in order to be allowed. This is something that is required not only by the Federal Fair Housing Act, but also the California Fair Employment and Housing Act. So it's they both build off of each other essentially. So the draft ordinance, this does incorporate the key components into the Los Altos zoning code. The draft ordinance does accomplish 4 programs which are required by December 2023. So this ordinance actually will help us achieve a good number of our initial deliverables within the first year as required in our programs. So the next steps, just to cover so everyone understands, is this item has already started to go through the process so that we're ready to upload this and publish this for the next agenda packet with the City Council for the August 22nd meeting to have its first reading and introduction of the draft ordinance, and then to have its subsequent adoption at the September 12th City Council meeting. So with that, staff is available for any questions.
Does any commissioner have a question for staff?
I just want to clarify, so how it's written, it complies with state law, and I know in our last meeting you talked about how hard we'd worked on the housing element, and we submitted it, and it got turned back, so this would finish the housing element to be adopted for Los Altos?
No, so the housing element is fully adopted. We are currently undergoing the hopefully last and final review with HCD. We have submitted right now, just so the commission and public are aware, our initial draft, which I have been spending the last 4 weeks on, compiling a lot of property site data to support our site inventory, and working on one additional program that HCD was interested in the city adding to our housing element. So we are still moving forward with the adopting housing element, as it is substantially what is expected for Los Altos to already be proceeding with. As relative to these, and it is important for the commission to know, these 4 programs were actually identified in the 2015-2023, so the 5th cycle housing element. This should have been done almost a decade ago. So we are quite behind on these 4. However, I will at least, as a way to help organize the collective thought, just in case there's questions or concerns as we keep on getting into the draft ordinance, is because these 4 kind of subsections of what is required from our housing element, that means that there was a lot of examples to draw on what has been accepted by the state. We're not all competing to discern what's coming out of the legislature's intent. So these are quite, regularly, if you look at jurisdiction to jurisdiction, just more so changing the exact zoning districts because obviously there are different names in each jurisdiction. So this will help to further implement the adopted sixth cycle, but it is not a caveat or carrot
Sure.
rather for us to be able to move forward.
And I was just getting at, that this is not our time to recreate the wheel. These have been published, these are for us to look at and generally say, yes, let's move them forward to a first reading.
Yes.
And not tear them apart trying to reinvent the wheel. I just wanted to establish
Yeah.
that, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Just one clarification.
Did you say that you were on?
Yeah,
I'm alive?
it's off. Yep, there you go.
Okay. That you have submitted everything to ACD now?
So
Or you still want to?
So as of yesterday, I transmitted initial drafts, revisions to HCD for informal comments. I am actually meeting with the two HCD reviewers next week on a Zoom call in order to discuss the initial revisions that have been made to gain hopefully some verbal confirmation that what we've provided is acceptable in the eyes of HCD. I will at least somewhat clarify for the commission and the public of anybody that might be on now at this point or anybody that might watch this later is that these comments were additional comments that were added and had never been requested prior to the letter that we received at the end of June. So in my professional opinion, we have gone above and beyond kind of what we initially thought we had to do. And have really done due diligence to provide extra meaningful data and justification on our sites inventory that is already contained in the initial adopted housing element, as well as diligently working towards an additional housing program that had not previously been requested. But I will at least say has been requested of several jurisdictions in the last 6 months of this same comment, even though it had not previously been received by jurisdictions.
Thank you.
It's like, Councilmember Weinberg, did you?
Thank you, Chair. I just want to make one additional
Yeah.
comment. Regardless of where the housing element process is with respect to HCD, the housing element, the second one that was submitted, is the city's policy. That was adopted by the council. So regardless of HCD's opinion of the housing element, the programs that Director Zorns has set forth in front of you, that is council policy. Now certainly you have the right to question the wisdom of that policy if that's where you're going to go. And of course, I know that the council wants to hear if you believe that the actual proposed ordinances don't comply with state law or don't conform with the policy as the council has adopted it. But the second version of the housing element is city policy.
Okay.
Now it's my understanding that we will have to adopt a third version of it to resubmit. My belief, the fact that we are here today leads me to believe that Director Zorns is not planning on suggesting any changes to the four programs.
Got it. That's perfect. Yeah, thank you.
Right.
That is correct. I'll just confirm that. And then also I do want to just further confirm these four programs we have never received feedback on from HCD. So these four are very confident for us to move forward fully as quickly as possible.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Questions, I guess, at this point. Yes.
Maybe that's not necessary.
Or you can turn on Eric's if you want. Sometimes one of
Okay, all right. Okay, so I'm just curious, like, do we permit these types of developments now, but they just require a conditional use permit?
So there are certain components that we already have to that no, it would not require a conditional use permit even under today's zoning. Some of these are, so for example, supportive and transitional housing, we have to already implement AB 101 regardless of if it's in our code or not. This is kind of one of the examples that HCD and the state have really wanted to clarify and have each jurisdiction individually assert their understanding and intention on further implementing each individual law as signed into law by the governor once it's been accepted. So for example, supportive and transitional housing, that one, we already have to do it. There's not really anything that we're taking away from our code. The farm worker housing, that is also something that does have state law that also would require us to process an application if we already had received it. There is not a conditional use permit requirement as it is today. And low barrier navigation centers as well. That is something that has standards that are built into the law. And reasonable accommodations is kind of the one that's a little bit interesting because that's why I mentioned in some email correspondence with each of you individually is that there is kind of too long of legislative history between the Federal Fair Housing Act and then the California Fair Employment and Housing Act, that's where you get reasonable accommodations from. There's not really one specific FAQ unless I were to provide you examples from jurisdictions that have essentially already discerned it. Again, that requirement I think came out in the early 2000s. But again, there are jurisdictions that did previously used to tie a conditional use to that. In Los Altos, though, we do not have any specific local land use controls that would prohibit or conditionally allow or anything of that nature. So these would all already be allowed. We would just have to follow state law, which is going to be a little bit hard for planners and any subsequent staff at the city to have to kind of go through all of the legislation.
Okay, so then what can you summarize then what is the difference between what is being proposed here and what is currently in our codes? Because it sounds like it's all allowed and there's no conditional use permit, there's no additional conditions.
Mm-hmm.
So other than the fact that we are kind of asserting support for these goals,
Mm-hmm.
okay, and I'm assuming this is kind of like a boilerplate that other cities are using.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, other than that, is this really necessary? Because it sounds like we can already fulfill the objectives of the housing element with our existing code.
So these 4 programs are explicit requirements of HCD, and you would not be able to gain certification without having a housing element that asserts that we would adopt a local ordinance consistent with state law. So we have to adopt these 4 sections of this chapter in order to be able to have a certified housing element. So we wouldn't have been able to create a housing element without the programs, and those programs are then what subsequently requires this draft ordinance. You are correct, as I already mentioned, that the zoning code does not have anything that prohibits these housing types. However, we do not have the regulations already built into our zoning code for essentially easy application. It really does tie to the ease of application of the actual regulations. This also, though, one of the reasons why the legislature as well as HCD want it individually integrated into each city's zoning code is because then we also have to explicitly identify which of the zones we are acknowledging are non-residential or multifamily uses, or would allow for that type of zoning, whether or not it's developed at that way currently or not. So it is a way to help further clarify and show what the city is essentially agreeing to on the front end, instead of just going on the back end and trying to manipulate or find the gray in our code or in the law. And so that's really where this comes down to, because there were several cycles ago that jurisdictions just had to acknowledge that it was a requirement and they didn't have to integrate it into their code. And now at this point, there is the expectation that it is to be adopted into each local jurisdictions.
Okay. All right, that's very helpful. Can I ask a few more questions? So can we ask questions that are specific to this now? Are we ready to?
We're doing questions, just not comments yet.
Okay, all right, then I will come back to these, so go
Okay,
ahead.
more comments,
Yeah.
okay, great. All right, now
I
it's.
just,
oh,
I just
sorry.
had one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
So, Director Zorns, isn't it true that we already committed to do this in the last housing element and we just haven't passed the ordinance?
That's correct.
So we're like 10 years behind or something?
We are 9 years behind.
Okay, thank you.
and just to clarify as well, we really have very little discretion in doing this, and the language that you have used in these changes is, from what you said, used in many other jurisdictions, so will not be subject to questions from HCD.
Correct, and I will also just further clarify, the low barrier navigation centers, otherwise, there have been minor inclusions of essentially local land use language in regards to what makes sense and puts it into our code by incorporation. That is actually a model ordinance that ABAG developed with consultation of HCD. So if the commission at all were to ask me for any changes to that, I would not be able to be supportive of that, and I would recommend to not change it to the council just based on the fact that HCD has already signed off on that model ordinance.
And we're trying to get the housing element approved.
Correct.
Okay. Are there any comments from the public, either in person or by Zoom?
There are none on Zoom.
None on Zoom? Okay, then let's move on to commissioner comments at this point. Kate, did you want to take us off?
Sure. I wasn't able to connect with Nick Zorns today, so I have some questions that maybe should have been asked earlier, but I'll try to be quick here. Okay, so how many inquiries has the city received from developers who want to build transitional housing or low barrier navigation centers? Or for that matter, employee housing?
So we don't have any historical knowledge that we've had interest in them. I will at least say that for low barrier navigation centers and transitional and supportive housing, those majority of the time are developed in collaboration as a joint venture between the city and a nonprofit developer or a not-for-profit developer, such as EH Housing, essentially, that is the individuals that are doing 330 Distal. It's also something sometimes just like 330 Distal, which was county, EH, and the city all coming together as a a triad of a partnership, essentially. So that is actually how those two specific sections or articles of the chapter would allow for us to leverage the ability to develop the supportive and transitional housing with specific specialty regulations that are allowed in the draft ordinance. So that's not really, those two sections are not really anything that we would probably see much interest from, because it's really something that our new housing manager would work is if there's interest and there's partnership and potential county and state and federal dollars to be able to put towards those projects, which there very commonly are. It's just about applying for them and getting together with a partner. Then that's when you're able to deploy that and leverage that zoning type for it. Now, with that being said, reasonable accommodations, because we've never had it, there's not really a method for the city to actually track it. We will be having to create a new record type for us to be able to actually track it and know that in the future years of how many we've received. However, I do know that there have been administrative modifications that have been granted here at the city. I do think it's just a handful that have been documented. Because we didn't have a process though, there's not really a way for us to have that mechanism and knowledge of exactly how many we processed. It must have been, if any had other been received, it would have been an administrative just wave of the wand, so to speak, in order to be able to allow for the reasonable accommodation to take place.
So distal, there's no component to distal that is transitional or low barrier net, right? There's no.
No, it's not. However, development, if you actually look at the actual prototype of the building and the way that they have on-site housing managers that are going to be there. There's 2 on-site. There's some other nuances to things that potential project could have included as a part of it to make it a supportive transitional housing project. It's just not a part of their overall prototype.
Okay, all right. And then, I have some other questions about like the numbers. Okay, so, for example, the development standards say that at least 90 square feet shall be provided for on-site supportive services. Is that number sort of what everyone's doing? Like where does that number come from? Because, I looked at that and like, well, is that something that we have discretion over as a city that, because that just seemed kind of low to me. Like if you're really providing services to people, how do you effectively do that with only 90 square feet? I mean, that's an office space. So I thought, well, is this where we have discretion as a planning commission to like tweak things like, percentages and square feet?
No, so in theory, yes, you could recommend to the council. However, I can at least tell you from knowing the legislative history of other jurisdictions that have attempted to do that, HCD has viewed that as a hindrance to the development of that specific specialized housing type, and they have subsequently received notice of violations from HCD regarding it, and they've had to revert back to what is the state minimum or most commonly accepted number, which is the 90. So that's why I took it from other model ordinances where that number has been used. In all of the jurisdictions that I reviewed, that's the most common number that I found.
Okay. All right, there is something else that for me seemed unclear in the same section. It says units within the development include at least 1 bathroom and a kitchen or other cooking facilities, including at a minimum a stovetop, a sink, and a refrigerator. So what is that saying? Is that saying units within the development collectively include 1 bathroom and 1 kitchen, or is that saying that each unit within the development will include at least 1 bathroom and a kitchen?
So the intent of that is that there can be common facilities that are shared. So kitchen wise, especially for, I believe you're referencing the supportive and transitional housing, correct?
Right.
Yeah, so that is units within the development excluding managers units include at least 1 bathroom and a kitchen or other cooking facilities including at minimum a stovetop, a sink, and a refrigerator. So the way that this, the intent is that if a specific developer wanted to have the communal cooking and communal restroom, kind of more of a dormitory style, they could, or they could have the flexibility of providing individual for each individual unit, which would be more so consider an SRO or a single room occupancy. And that's generally what we see. So the intent of this is to provide them a flexibility of the common spaces for the supportive and transitional component. That is also why there are on-site managers required in order to even have it established as supportive and transitional housing, is because it is supposed to be an area for them to be able to come into communal common spaces and be able to actually have some of that supportive kind of housing component that's actually built into their programming, essentially.
So just curious, then what protects the future residents from a situation where someone has come in and they've built 100 SROs and there's inadequate common areas, like, if there's not enough toilets, something like that. I mean, is there something overlaying this, where the city can say, well, you don't have enough toilets for the people that are going to be living there?
So the California Building Code actually will require, based on occupancy, them to have communal bathroom spaces. And then that number is set and there's a threshold that would actually be applied, but it also is kind of essentially a proportional calculation of a percentage that, if you had 100 units, I don't know what the number is off the top of my head, you'd have to have 15 bathrooms, so essentially 15 toilets. So that's, I mean, it's kind of what we end up seeing a lot of times for specific types of commercial types. The residential and mixed use or multifamily will have its own specific calculation. Commercial is always going to be lower because a lot of folks aren't using the common facilities as frequently as, you know, needing to have it open and ready for residential. So there is going to be something that's built into that specific, but that's not something that we would house in zoning. That's something that is subject to change based on the
Okay.
building code.
All right. Okay, another question about the parking. So it says no parking shall be required within a half mile of a public transit stop. And is this true for every type of development now? Because I mean, everyone in Los Altos is probably within a half a mile of a transit stop. I'm assuming a bus stop is a transit stop, right? So is this kind of new kind of approach where we don't need parking if we're near transit? Is this applied to all projects, including single family now?
Not to single family. Single family does not have anything associated like this, at least not yet. The legislature really hasn't had some of that tied to it. Multifamily and anything definitely that provides specialized housing for affected populations, such as specialized and transitional, so the unhoused, they do have that benefit. Because this specific development type of transitional and supportive housing is something that is often, and it's very commonly talked about in you know, our countywide CDBG meetings that I am on monthly, is, you know, they are hard to pencil out a lot of times. That's why it needs to usually be a collective of a not-for-profit or nonprofit and also a public-facing agency to be able to collaborate on the financial component. So this is one of those things that ends up being something that's quite difficult usually financially to be able to really get the funding source. So anything which the legislature has affirmed time and time again is parking is a hindrance to the development of multifamily housing, or definitely specialized housing as well. I will at least acknowledge is that supportive and transitional housing, the definition that is used in the legislation is a public transit stop, which is different than major transit stop. So that means if there's a bus stop of any frequency, it is allowed because it is meant to be that it is a different specialized housing type. Now, if it's just a multifamily, even 330 distal, it's in a major transportation corridor as well as a half a mile from a major transit stop. There are different requirements for that than for this one. So it really just depends on the development type and then also the actual location of where it's actually being cited. I will say the public transit stop, this specific use of the term is not very common in the housing laws. It's most commonly major transit stop. So essentially for us, El Camino Real.
Okay. So right now, if someone came in and they wanted to build multifamily market rate, if they said, I don't want to build any parking because I'm a half a mile from a major transit hub, that wouldn't fly because they're not transitional or a navigation center. There would be a parking requirement for them. Is that correct?
There would if they were 100% doing something 100% market rate. The city has not received a 100% market rate project for multifamily in several years. That's twofold because we have inclusionary housing, which is a 15% or a 20% requirement depending on the type, whether or not it's rental or for sale, or depending on what level of affordability essentially, which then mirrors density bonus. So we also do not really receive multifamily housing developments without a combination of density bonus. So it would have an affordable component, which then would allow them access to the major transit stop parking ratio requirements. So there's a lot of complexities with that, but that's But major transit stop and density bonus type projects and market rate is not a part of anything with this specific ordinance.
I think we need to sort of focus our comments on these particular 4 things that we're being asked to look at, as opposed to a more general discussion about qualifications regarding other things. So if we could keep our comments to these 4 things that we have to do tonight, that would be helpful.
Okay, I do have one more question. So this relates to the reasonable accommodation. So I'm trying to understand this. So someone with a disability who is prevented from enjoying a property might make an application, and the property owner has to sign the application. Is that correct? So I want to live in Distal, and there's a vacancy, and I've applied for that unit, but I can't get into it. So I make an application. The property owner signs the application. It goes through, and the city says, yes, we will waive whatever the codes are to allow this person access. But in the city doing that, does that compel the property owner to do that, to make those modifications? Or are we just assuming that they would because they signed the application?
I mean, most commonly in actual practice, yeah, we would see that the property owner or the potential prospect tenant, or even a special kind of advocate group that helps a lot of individuals living with disabilities to retrofit or provide the same kind of ease of access to a property. For multifamily, specifically the 330 Distal, that's a very hard one to kind of make that. Those buildings are all going to be built ADA compliant, and so I mean the nuance of something would be incredibly low for someone to request reasonable accommodations. I will tell you, as in practice, the most common time that I have seen residential or a reasonable accommodations actually exercised is for single family zoning, when the zoning code has some type of strict language that would prohibit. Most commonly, I'll tell you, is I've processed 3 in my career for wheelchair ramps that were explicitly essentially viewed as a structure in the side yard setback because it had essentially a 0 lot lines. And there were jurisdictions that have tried to fight that because their neighbor didn't want something right next to the property line. And the reasonable accommodations provided the ability for the disabled party to be able to actually move forward ministerially rather than go through the variance process under zoning.
Okay, but to answering my question though, there's an application that is approved does not compel the property owner to do these modifications.
No, I mean, but I wouldn't imagine them signing off on an application as the property owner
Right. Okay.
without the intent to allow it.
Okay, thank you.
May I add something there? This also brings in line with the Americans with Disabilities Act, which does impose an affirmative duty on property owners to remove architectural barriers to access. Now, whether that applies in all the buildings for which this might apply is a question in my mind, but the answer to your question is yes, the person who wants the accommodation can sue the property owner. What this does is provide, as Nick was saying, a kind of administrative off-ramp to avoid exactly that. Okay, so all this does is say the ADA applies in virtually any situation, and we're just making people stick with that.
Okay.
So.
Are there other comments from commissioners? I would just like to thank staff. I think you've done a great job of getting the right language here before us and making it straightforward for us to approve. So thank you.
Sure, I actually,
Yep.
the motion to approve the resolution and move forward.
Yeah, ordinance.
I'll second that if we've said everything.
Yeah, it's done.
No final comments? If not, we will move for that. Stephanie, you can call.
All right, Commissioner Disney,
Yes.
Commissioner Beninato,
Yes.
Commissioner Duran.
Yeah.
Commissioner Ro-
Darn, gotta get that name right, come on, you know, work hard for that name.
She really likes Duran Duran, apparently.
Commissioner Roach.
Yes.
Commissioner Steinle.
Yes.
Vice Chair Ahi.
Yes.
And Chair Mensinger. So that is a unanimous recommendation.
Not necessarily a surprise, but I will be bringing forward housing element implementation ordinances consecutively every month for the rest of the year. So that is something to at least just be aware of. So please, if you do have any travel plans, just letting us know just so that we can make sure that we establish quorum. We do have a body of 7, so it is a little bit easier for us, essentially, because we usually only ever have 1 out. So it's, obviously the likelihood of someone unexpectedly multiple times over is not incredibly high. So that would just be my one request. So we will be moving forward with a lot of that. Like I mentioned previously, we will be working and consulting with HCD as of next week, and hopefully getting some initial feedback about our housing element. So that's pretty huge and significant. I mentioned to most of you, as you can see, the chamber is kind of a temporary workstation, just so that everyone knows this is not how it will be. The front counter or the permit counter here at City Hall has been getting some much needed ADA improvements and safety improvements the last 3 weeks. And so it's trending at finishing in the next week. So we will then have all of this moved out and moved back in and have a newer front counter that's fully ADA compliant moving forward. So just so that everyone is aware.
I have a question.
Yes.
On the timing of the meetings, you say that once a month, we're going to address housing element, or for each of our meetings for the next?
To be quite honest, I probably will group some of them together so that I probably will only be bringing them to one of the meetings a month, just because of, just so you guys understand, it's, and I know you know about our public hearing notice requirements. That's sometimes what ends up becoming kind of really hard to manage when we have so many ordinances going. However, kind of bundling them together similarly like tonight, I could have set these 4 separately. It just didn't make sense. So we are also in really good standing. We have already accomplished, I believe off the top of my head, 7 of the 26 deliverables that were required in the first year. You just moved for the city council to consider another 4. So we're already about the halfway mark. And the majority of the rest of them aren't necessarily ordinance requirements, other than the rezoning of sites, which will be proceeding by the end of this year. So realistically, we're actually in pretty good standing for moving forward on time with everything. So yeah, we most likely will not have separate at 2 meetings a month for the housing element, which will just help to collectively allow for staff to organize and make sure we're meeting our legal requirements.